Hey everyone, it's Mexie. Welcome to another video. So I held a Twitter poll some time ago now. Apologies for being so busy. I'm just trying to wrap up the PhD. But you all voted to learn about the tragedy of the commons, which is something that I think is a very misunderstood concept. It's something that is thrown around in the support of economic thinking and privatization and marketization. And much like other floating signifiers like liberty and freedom, it's actually been used to enlist people to support their own disenfranchisement and to support policies that lead to increased degradation of the environment. So what do we mean by commons? Commons are resources that are shared by many, whose benefits accrue to many, but that are not owned by any one. And they're often not very regulated. So examples could be fisheries, forests, soils, basically anything. Even we can think about our atmosphere at times as commons. So the tragedy of the commons is based on the neoliberal assumption that every single person in this world is a rational economic actor, and that they will always act in their own crude economic self-interest, even if that harms the people or the group as a whole or the environment that surrounds them. Ironically, or maybe not ironically, obviously, neoliberalism as an ideology also seeks to produce people who are rational economic actors. So it encourages people to be that rational economic man, if you will, in order to get people to buy in to participating in capitalism, participating in their own subjugation and environmental degradation. So the tragedy is that all of these individualized because no one ever communicates or works together. The tragedy is that all of these individual people acting in their own economic self-interest will deplete or overuse a resource which harms the interest of the whole group or the whole society at large. As the theory goes, rational actors will be motivated to cheat in these situations where there is open access to a common resource, because they'll be thinking, I gotta get mine. If I don't get mine, someone else is gonna get theirs, and then there's gonna be none left for me. So I gotta get mine while the getting's good. That's basically the theory. And this is the case even if it does not make rational sense for the group's long-term interest or even the individual's long-term interest. If it makes sense for the short-term economic gain of the individual, then they will do it, so assumes the tragedy. Interestingly, this is almost one of the main critiques of laissez-faire economics, is that everyone acting in their own crude self-interest will never produce the most desirable ends for the whole. It will never produce the most socially and environmentally desirable ends. This is ironic because the theory of the tragedy of the commons is often used by economists or, economic-minded people to justify privatization and applying market principles to the natural world. So this tragedy idea was popularized by Garrett Hardin in 1968 in his article in the well-respected journal Science. So very importantly, Hardin created this entire theory based on a thought experiment that he did, thinking about herders herding cattle in an open pasture. So I'm going to show a quick clip that explains this thought experiment that he went through.
This is a model called the tragedy of the commons, which should be called the problem with open access since it has little to do with the commons, and tragedy's kind of dramatic. Let's say there's some land with grass on it that people use as pasture for their animals. Nobody owns it, and anyone can come and graze their livestock here. We're assuming that people don't communicate or work together, so we would call this an open access field. Let's assume the number of animals this field can feed is based on the quantity and quality of the grass, which is based on the health of the soil, and it can only hold this many animals. This is the carrying capacity. If animals are added beyond this, the grass can't regrow fast enough to support them all. Also, the grass protects the soil from erosion. If too many animals are around, the field may decline in productivity, lowering the carrying capacity. The animals will be less healthy and provide lesser quality products, lowering the profit each animal provides. So it's in this group's best interest to keep the number of animals on the field at or below the carrying capacity. But every herdsman that puts an animal on the field will get the direct benefit that that animal provides for them, but they would only share a portion of the cost of the degraded field. If the field were at carrying capacity and a herdsman decides to add an extra animal, the added animal takes some of the food that would have gone to the others. This reduces their value. The owner of that additional animal comes out ahead ahead because even though all his animals are a little bit less healthy, he has more of them. But each herdsman acts under these incentives and will keep adding animals to their herd or let their animals graze longer, so long as it's profitable to themselves. But really, they're all losing out, kind of like the prisoner's dilemma. Contrast this to a situation where only one person owns it. If they add an extra animal, they're only hurting themselves, so they don't do it. Since new people can't be excluded from the field, there's almost no point in boycotting the use because someone else could just come in. None of the herdsmen own the field, and they can see that the field may not be around forever. They see no point in conservation and just try to use it before someone else does. Okay, so we can go on to apply this model to unregulated open access fisheries, open access forests, and unregulated college dorm sink. But the problem with applying this model to the real world is that we have to assume, among other things, that people don't communicate or work together, which isn't true. With a field like this, people will generally get together and make plans about its use. They may act as a single unit or just partition it into sections, and they'll regulate the number of people that can use it. And if people are working together and communicating, then it's not really open access.
So they outlined some of the problems with this assumption in that video, mainly that nobody will talk to each other or communicate together whatsoever in this village, and they'll just keep on running to their collective doom. But they also note that it should be understood as the tragedy of open access, not the tragedy of the commons. Because in this example, the pasture is the only thing that's held communally or open to the community. The resources that are the livestock, which actually bring the people benefits, are all privately owned. And yes, this is an awkward analogy for a vegan, but we're not going to get into that. So we have the grass here as open access, but the resources of the livestock being privately owned by individuals in competition with one another, not by people who are communally managing a shared resource. If you're managing in common, then you are managing communal property. And so as a community, you would decide how many cows to graze, and then how you would communally distribute the benefits that you would get from raising those number of cows or other kinds of livestock. Or if there was private ownership, then managing as commons would involve communication and rules set up by the community to govern how each resource user would act in that space, and what the penalties would be for misusing the space, and how enforcement would be carried out. So the tragedy of open access under a system of private ownership of the means of production and competition to increase your profits, capitalism, the tragedy of open access under capitalism is visible everywhere. And one good example is the decline of the cod stocks. Individual fishers in competition with one another for profits all have an incentive to overfish so that they can make more money. As stocks decline, scarcity increases, and so value of the remaining fish also increases, which perversely creates even more incentive to overfish. So to me, this clearly demonstrates the tragedy of capitalism and, competition in order to increase one's own profits. But nobody really wants to talk about that, do they? They just want really good examples of why we should privatize everything and keep the accumulation of capital moving up, up, up. So the two solutions put forward for this tragedy are government regulation or privatization, the latter being the preferred choice for most people who are pushing this theory. So they want to enclose these resources or enclose this space and hand it over to a single person and not the entire community, because it is assumed or argued that the private owner would not deplete those resources because it would not be in their long-term economic interest to destroy the resource that they own. Given the rapid decline in environmental health over the past few decades, you can guess that this solution is not making a lot of great headway, because both of these solutions actually can lead to problems in their own right and can lead to degradation of the environment in their own right. One example is with forests, like privatizing forests. So the owners or the loggers want to make as much money as possible and cut down the trees. This is very, very bad for the ecosystem at large, but it's good business. Same with monocropping. This is very bad for ecosystems and their resiliency, but it's very profitable. We see this in big agribusiness everywhere, where the soils are being continually depleted and producing lower and lower yields, and yet because of competition between private owners, each owner is compelled to continue exploiting to stay in the game even as the resource dwindles. This is one of the problems with the theory that, in theory, the owner would not want to degrade the resources, but if that owner has very, very tough competitors and is in a very competitive market, then they may have to deplete their resources just to stay competitive. With government regulations, there may be issues with the enforcement of those regulations, Or if you're a neoliberal capitalist government, you may impose strict regulations on the resource users who are not actually causing the problem, like indigenous people, while big polluters and major resource extraction can be given pretty inconsequential regulations and actually tax benefits for extracting that resource. So in both, there is the potential for the exclusion of the poor. However, this is far more salient with the privatization schemes. The poor don't have the money to access those resources, so they are excluded, while the wealthy continue to reap the benefits even as the resource continues to be depleted, which is pretty much what we're seeing around the world now. Again, these are all problems with capitalism and the private management of our resources. So it's extremely annoying and nonsensical when people try to use this very problematic thought experiment from the 1960s to legitimate more privatization and to say that communal management is the real problem here. So thankfully, this ridiculous theory was really thrown on its head by Elinor Ostrom in 2009. She won the Nobel Prize for Economics for her critique of the tragedy of the commons type thinking, and she was actually the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics. The Nobel Committee said that she effectively challenged the conventional wisdom that common property is poorly managed and should either be regulated by authoritarian enforcement or privatization. So while Hardin did a thought experiment and then used his own story to develop the theory, Eleanor actually went out into the world and did research, and she looked at innumerable cases from around the world where people were successfully managing common resources in a sustainable way. She showed that in practice, local communities coming together and sustainably managing commons or managing resources as common property was actually the rule and not the exception. And remember that rational economic thinking is a learned behavior. Hardin's thought experiment came from a very particular cultural bias that doesn't really hold much water when you actually go out in the world and look at how local communities are actually organizing. What we also don't see as this universal baseline for every community around the world is this rational economic man who doesn't speak to anybody or cooperate with anyone and that sees everyone around him as a competitor. And again, in the West, you will be taught to be this rational economic person. I keep saying man, regardless of whichever gender that you identify with, because historically, patriarchy and capitalism have been very interlinked. But you will be taught to be this rational economic person. You will be taught to make all of your decisions based on crude economic self-interest, regardless of the consequences for other people, other citizens around you, people who are your neighbors, right? If you're homeless on the street and you're my neighbor, well, whatever, because I'm acting in my own crude economic self-interest. And I guess you just must be doing a very shitty job acting in your own. This is the narrative that is sold to us to keep us participating in this brutal, exploitative, and unequal system, and believing that if we have made it, then we've made it based on merit. And if someone else has not, then they are there because of their lack of merit, and we should not be pushing for redistributive policies, or we should not be, extending our hand and thinking about how we can share resources more commonly. And you will be taught this to legitimize a system where the few people at the top continue to benefit from depleting resources, while the entire rest of the world suffers the consequences, the environmental health consequences of that depletion. We've accepted these ideas into our hearts and homes, not realizing that this is the problem. This is the reason that we don't have any global sustainability. It's this private market system. So the solution to that is not more privatization. So I'm going to end now, like I normally do, with a badass quote. We've swallowed the idea of the tragedy of the commons hook, line, and sinker, when in reality, this is a ruse that actually reflects the tragedy of capitalism and its endless wars of plunder. Garrett Hardin's Achilles heel was that he never stopped to think about how the grazing cattle were already privately owned. What might happen when we recognize an actual commons as a commons without presuppositions of private ownership? What might happen when we start to pay closer attention to the prefiguration of alternatives that are already happening and privileging these experiences as the most important forms of organization? What might happen when instead of swallowing the bitter pills of competition and merit, we instead focus our energies not on medicating ourselves with neoliberal prescriptions, but on the deeper healing that comes with cooperation and mutual aid? So I'd like to give a special thanks to my patrons. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in another video.